Where do you live? Where do you live? That's one of the first questions we usually want to have answered when we meet somebody. There's a whole host of questions like, what's your name? We try to find out what they do. And then we say, where do you live? By knowing where they live, we usually can find a way to sort of size them up. And sometimes we're a little bit more subtle than just, where do you live? We might say, are you from around here? Or if you're from the greater Toledo area, I've noticed a lot of people will say, and what parish do you belong? Especially if they're Catholic, what parish? Because that way you can kind of figure out which part of town they're in. Where do you live? Sometimes it works against you. I remember some years ago a woman telling me that she and her husband had moved into a new house in a very, very nice, secluded neighborhood. It really was a step above for most people. But this neighborhood, this development, was in the woods out in the country. It happened that because it was out in the country, the U.S. mailing address was of this little burg not too far away. It was the closest town. But that little town was kind of impoverished. And she discovered that as people discovered from her, if she said, I live near so-and-so, they kind of looked down on her. And she even noticed that on her personal checks, because it had her name and mailing address, if somebody saw that, if she was trying to buy something, the merchants were a little bit more reluctant, almost like the check would bounce. She told me that she shared this with one of her neighbors after she was observing it. And the neighbor said, yes, I've noticed the same thing when we first moved in as well. So we had our checks reprinted. So now it has our name, the name of the development, this wooded area we live in, and then the mailing address. And she said, since we've done that, we've had no problems. It seems a little unfair, but sometimes when people say, where do you live? They feel like they now know all that they need to know about you. It's kind of sad, actually, if you think about it. But today, on this last Sunday before Christmas, I want to ask a major question. Where does God live? And I'm going to go to the first reading today, the second book of Samuel. There's this wonderful conversation that goes on between David and God in his dream. The passage begins with David saying, here I am living in this wonderful palace. Everything's wonderful. And God, who was still sort of equated with the Ark of the Covenant, God is out there in a tent. Now, a tent, of course, could be kind of fashionable, and it was well made in the Middle East. But at the same time, a tent is temporary. It moves on. So I think David was basically saying, I need to create a temple for God for two things. One is to honor God. The other one is to make sure God doesn't move away from us move the tent away. Let's control God. Then he has the dream, and God says, David, you want to build a house for me? I'll tell you what, I'm going to build a house for you. And then he uses the word house. God uses the word house in a metaphorical sense. He says, I will dwell in your heirs. I will be one of your great-grandchildren. I will be the one who comes among you, and you will never have an end to your kingdom. And he even uses the word house. I will be coming into the house of David. That's the backdrop for this wonderful gospel reading from Luke, which is setting the scene for the birth of Jesus, because the angel Gabriel comes and says some of the same words to Mary. The one to be born will be of the house of David, and the kingdom will have no end. I'm sure Mary didn't understand it, but it's really kind of amazing to me that God says, I don't really just dwell in a tent. A tent is temporary. I'm not even going to be confined to a nice temple. I'm going to live among you and within you. My house is in the human race. Now, it's also kind of interesting. Mary was a very poor woman, very poor family, and she lived in Nazareth. And Nazareth was, at that time, just a kind of a nothing little town. By the way, Nazareth is much bigger now, but it's still sort of disdained. It's kind of a nothing area. My personal memory of Nazareth is when I went to get a cup of coffee and I got lost and I couldn't find my way back. But that's another story. But Nazareth, to this day, people sort of like, oh, there's nothing important there. Isn't it interesting that God chose to dwell in a nothing area and in poor people? And by doing so, to make his home, his house, among all of us. That's what we're celebrating. Where does God live? God lives here. God lives in our hearts. God lives among people of goodwill who accept him. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, around Thanksgiving time, I was very honored to be invited to participate in the dedication of a Habitat for Humanity house in Toledo. And it was done by Zoom. And I had the time, so I tuned in. And there were just a few people, and it started with someone with a camera walking with the family through the house. And it was a mother and a couple of kids. And the kids were very excited, and they looked at the room was still empty and said, this is going to be my bedroom. And the next one, yeah, and this is going to be where I will sleep. And then they had a little prayer of dedication and a blessing. Then finally they interviewed the woman who was going to take ownership of the house. She was overwhelmed in tears that this dream was coming true. And she said, I can't believe it. I can't believe how fortunate I am. Thank you to everybody who supported, who made it happen. I will have a place for my kids. There's a backyard. We'll have some security, and we will create a home out of this house. My dream is fulfilled. As we talk about Jesus born among us, our dreams are fulfilled. The house of the Lord is us. God brings us security. God brings us hope. And no matter what happens, we know we are never alone.